and it's all about, tonight is about sexual shame. So this is a huge topic, and I'm never going to do it justice in one evening. So I just kind of want to frame it, spend some time thinking about it, see what your thoughts on it, those of you that are joining me live in the group, and just spend some time just acknowledging that this really does exist and actually has a profound impact on relationships, people's lives, how people show up. I've been having a lot of conversations lately with people that are really struggling to celebrate their sexual energy. And all of it is dressed up in shame. And much of that shame comes from lack of education, social misconceptions, media. Don't even start me on that one. But just all these stories we're told or things we're not told that really shape how we perceive sex and sexual energy, and how we perceive what we can be and how we can show up. And my journey was very much that. My journey was very much like brought up in a Christian family, very middle class family. I served in church, sang in a choir. My parents were very private around their intimacy. Intimacy was never really spoken about. My sex education was very limited, both in school and at home. So kind of sex was very much, do you know what my main sex education was? It was watching things like the Carry On films, Open All Hours, Heidi High, like, you know, these kind of role models and energies that we kind of picked up in, of like, that's what relationships were about. You know, that kind of like the humor, but it was that kind of tongue-in-cheek humor, that the intimacy, connections and stuff was all a little bit tongue-in-cheek. That was kind of the only real it was the only real story I had available to me. It was the only real kind of thing I had to judge what was acceptable within my home, what was acceptable within my my family, but also what was acceptable within society, because that was what I was exposed to. So, you know, then falling pregnant at a young age and being kind of banished from the church. You know, I wasn't allowed to be a server, wasn't allowed to sing in the church choir, all because I'd had sex and fallen pregnant. And yet the community that I thought was really stand by me and support me wasn't there for me. So that kind of told me other stories, even at the age of 17, 18, about, you know, how that would be perceived and what that meant to other people around me. And then as I went on to explore and unwrap my own sexuality and my own understanding of what sexual energy was, all of these other information just filtered in, other people's opinions, just all these social constructs that build up what is right and wrong. And actually the one thing I think I've learned, it's probably taken me like 30 years, is there is no right and wrong. There is no right and wrong. You know, it doesn't matter as long as we are not hurting another human being, unless they wanted it and they consented and all of that stuff's in place. But unless, you know, unless we're doing something that's seen as really, really, you know, illegal, then actually how we celebrate our sexual energy, our sexuality and our sexual being has absolutely nothing to do with anyone else. But we still have all this shame around it. So much so that many couples can't even have a conversation with each other about what their desires and needs and wants and how they want to express themselves. We don't have the conversation because it is so packed with shame. So packed with shame. So has anybody here in the group got any stories, any light bulbs, anything from their younger years that really inflicted their view and opinion? It kind of really shaped how they felt about sexual energy, because I know this is not just my story. You know, you might not have all had children when you're 18 and you might not have all been kicked out of church, but you know, I know this isn't my story, and it's one of the reasons I picked this topic to do first for my kind of spreading my wings a bit further is because it shouldn't be like this. We shouldn't be riddled with guilt and fear and shame and judgment around something that is just our right to have in our life. Sex is a birthright. In fact, that's how you got here. It's like, how can we be so shameful around something that created us? I just the whole thing really bizarre. But I've lived the journey. I've lived the journey of the shame. Yeah, someone in the group has just said Catholic upbringing, 100%. Like, there's so much. So I've got a list here of kind of our guilt, our self-disgust, our shame, our self-judgment is all around culture, religion, and what we expect as I've got tickly nose, societal norms. It comes from that the energy of what we see as right and wrong. And do you know what the funny thing is? Actually, if you look back in history, you know, you think we'd become more liberated and more free and more open as time's gone on. But actually, if you go back to Victorian and beyond, like, they had a lot more fun. There's a lot more going on than there is now. We've kind of gone backwards. It's like, surely we should be more liberated and more open and more accepting. But actually, what's happened is somehow that doesn't happen. You know, we seem to become more closeted and more restricted in how we celebrate it. And definitely, you know, our social values, religion, culture, you know, there's still a lot to be said for how we make people feel around sexuality and how they explore their sexual energy. Some of the other things, you know, that knock-on effect of if someone feels fear, shame, guilt, all that energy, actually the knock-on effect, I don't think people realise, you know, how not having the conversations when we're younger, how not celebrating and having open conversations about sexuality, the knock-on effect that has. And I don't even think we realise when it's happening to us. Like, the impact of not having those conversations when we're younger, about not talking about it as a society, means that actually it impacts people in a huge way, in a profound way. You know, that people can't celebrate a kink or a fetish or a fantasy or a desire in a really healthy way, and that we lock all of this inside of us, all this stuff that's absolutely normal. You know, we were designed for that. That's what we were designed for. Like, how that can be locked inside us. And I know for me, you know, the being the Christian upbringing, the values around what sex was, the understanding about what intimacy was, led to like 25 years of battling with myself, because, you know, I felt that being bisexual was a betrayal of my family. I felt that some of the lifestyle choices I made were problematic and going to cause what would be the word I'd use? Going to cause shame and fear on other people. And actually, I'm not saying that there's people around me jumping up and down saying, "Yay, she's talking about all this amazing stuff all over social media," because that's their story. Like, I was part of that story, and what I want to do is break that cycle and say we don't have to be ashamed if we've got a foot fetish, or we're bisexual, or we like BDSM, or we like kink. As long as we're being safe, why do we have to keep it a secret? Why does it have to be something that nobody talks about? Because what I've found is when we do talk about it, we're actually not alone. We're not alone. I got to the point in my life where my two worlds, my love for sexual energy, to frame it in one way, my love for sexual energy and my teaching role and my other choices in life were clashing so much so that, as many of you know, I ended up with alopecia. I ended up really poorly because I was living in so much shame and fear about the choices I was making that it made me ill. And I've worked with people that I know have come to me and have had erectile dysfunction, painful sex, premature ejaculation, like all of that stuff is because of fear and shame and guilt and judgment. It's the story that we've told ourselves so many times. It shows up in our body. It shows up in our health. Our health is a compass to our emotions. It's mental health stuff. So if we are in fear and shame and guilt around sex, then we manifest health conditions. And I've had them. I've certainly had painful times in my life where I've experienced painful sex, and I've had other stuff show up that's just been where fear is showing up in my body, and almost to the point where the health conditions I've had are about rejecting intimacy and pleasure, like pushing that stuff away. It's almost like I've manifested something, which means nobody's going to want to come near me. And it's just like, whether, whatever that might be, that was me. I created that in my body because I was a fear of what I was sharing and how I was showing up. And again, I know I'm not the only one. So just think back even to your own childhood. Like, what was the stories? What was the stuff that you were told that makes you feel in a place of shame? Maybe about some of your desires, some of your kinks. What is the taboos in our society that makes us feel that we can't have these conversations? How does it show up in your life? And does it cause issues within relationships? Does it cause issues within your own health? Does it cause issues even within body image? Of how we should behave and how we should look is all part of sort of sexual shame. It's all about how do we show up. And it shouldn't be. Makes me so sad. It shouldn't be. We shouldn't be in a position in 2023 where we're still hiding the conversations and we're still not feeling that we can express ourselves. I remember working with a guy a few years ago, and I know I've shared this story before about the guy that had a foot fetish and was absolutely beside himself because there was a potential it was going to come out, in the family and people were going to find out, and it was a secret. And this guy was near to suicidal. And not only did we trace the story or trace the history of his kink back to his mother when he admired her feet, and that's a whole other story, but like we found the source of it, which actually he was like, oh my God, like that's amazing. And we kind of just celebrated the fact that he was honoring women in a really loving way. It was particularly women's feet that he liked. Nothing against men's feet, but that was his thing. And he admired that in a woman in quite a big way. He had feet, not people's feet. He had artificial feet, and it was really, it was a huge part of his life, and it was about to be something he was being outed on, and he was just like, what do I do? And I'm like, own it. And it, we had a conversation. We worked out the journey that he'd been on and where it had come from. And actually, by the time he left, he did own it. He put it all over his own Facebook page. and celebrated it. But that was a hard, that's a really hard thing to do. And I was like, some like boobs, some like bums, you like feet. But how do you overcome that when there's so many people out there that have just got so many rigid thought processes around connection and intimacy? How do we move that forward? Anyone got any thoughts on how do we change a culture to other than having more of me, I guess, which might be a bit too much? How do we change this shame around sexual energy, around sex? How do we change the shame that we created around this natural thing called sexual energy? How do we change? Where do we start? Anyone got any thoughts on where we start? I mean, the education system feels like a good place. That still doesn't feel right. But the fact that we've got so much shame and it comes from so many different places, religion, culture, media, like how do we do this? How do we change this? Because I'm seeing the knock-on effect and it ain't pretty. It's not pretty. And prevention is better than cure. There's so many of us so confused and stressed and shameful and anxious about our own sexual journey. There's got to be a way of changing some of that so that people don't have to be in that place. So someone's sharing, learn not to judge others. Oh, I wish we lived in that world. Not just with sexual energy either. Just live, hopefully. I think talking about it more, making people more aware, because it still is very, oh God, excuse me, sudden yawn coming on. It's still it is a taboo subject. It is around, there is a lot of shame still around it. I'm starting to do more talks in groups and people get a little bit like, oh, do we want to be talking about this? Like, are we just opening a can of worms? Why don't get that woman in? Let's just skip around it. It's like, mental health was the taboo. This is part of mental health for me. Like, I want to go in and talk in businesses and I want to open the conversation up because it needs to be had. And I think as much as I think once people, I don't feel since I suppose come out was probably the best word, since I've started talking about my journey and sexual energy and my kind of understanding, my journey with it. Oh, really sorry. I don't know where that's come from. I don't particularly feel judged. I actually feel quite celebrated. Like people, I get a lot of support that I'm having these conversations. So I probably feel less judged, although it's a hard thing to do sometimes because, not everybody wants to talk to you. I quite often walk in rooms and people walk out because they don't want to do it. They don't want to talk to me. So that's fine. But actually, I don't take that as judgment. I take that as people just feel uncomfortable about this subject. And I get that. That's not a judgment on me. That's kind of their own story. So I feel less judged now than I've ever felt. And there's the most out there in the world that anyone's ever known about me because it's all over podcasts. And I did another radio thing this week, which is coming out soon. Like, it's all out there. And I probably feel less judged now than I've ever done. But there's not very many of us having the conversation. And that to me is the important bit. That if we can have the conversation, by having the conversation, we change the energy around it. And then people naturally judge people less, which I think is what you're saying. It's like, how do we, I know in this space, in this group and in the platforms that I'm on, I'm not judged. Not everyone agrees with everything I say, but I don't feel judged. Or I wouldn't be sharing the stuff I share. I don't feel in that position. But I have done, and it's taken me to some pretty dark places. When you are living in fear that you might lose your job because you're bisexual, or because you have made some choices around how you want to celebrate your sexual self, and you're hiding and living in secret because of the choices you made. And actually, if I hadn't have felt shame around some of the early stuff that happened in my life, I probably wouldn't have gone out and sought the other stuff, because I'd have had someone to talk to. It was because I was trying to work it all out. It was because I was trying to work out what I wanted, and I was doing it alone, like trying to fathom it out, because no one was having the conversation. So therefore I was just fumbling, literally fumbling around in the dark in so many ways, trying to work out what it was all about. And it's like, well, that didn't work, so we'll have another fumble over here and another fumble over there. And a number of fumbles later, I still couldn't work it out, but still no one was having the conversation, because it's too shameful. We don't talk about sex. So I made mistakes, and I made errors, and I made a number of poor choices because no one was having a conversation. I didn't know where to go to get the help. I didn't know where to go to have the conversation. And I'm sure most people listening to this can think of connections that they've had, intimate connections that they've had, that they really wish they hadn't. But it was just a way of finding out and exploring. It was just a way of testing the water. It was a way of navigating your way through something that is really complex. Sexual energy is really complex. Sexual relationships are really complex. Or is that just me? Maybe I've just made it complex. What do we think? Our sexual relationships? I think they are. But maybe let's just maybe I've made them complicated. Maybe I've made them difficult. Maybe I am carrying the shame because of the stuff I've done, but I don't believe I would have done all of those things if I hadn't felt shameful. I think the shame kind of just spiraled. It just spiraled. How can we be created by two people having sex, whatever that looked like for them? It's our parents. We probably don't want to know too much about it. But how can we come from that beautiful energy and then we don't talk about it ever? Like, no one has these conversations. And it's all like a bit awkward, and we're made to feel guilty because we've got naughty fantasies and create desires in our minds that we're too scared to share with even our partners. So someone said, no, they were complicated as well as fun. Yeah. And then they laid another, like, it was like, yep, I've worked that one out, but now I've got something else I've got to try and work out, because I discovered this and now I don't know what to do with that either. Like, it's just like there was just layers to it. Layers and layers and layers. But wouldn't it be amazing if these conversations were had, and it wasn't just, in some very concerning documentaries, shall we say, sometimes that come up on TV. And I do wonder what our next generation are going to be tapping into when they're watching stuff, and I'm not going to name programs, but like reality TV. Just makes me really sad that that's what, the next generation are using as part of their measure of what a relationship looks like, and potentially sexual connections look like. I don't know how we can break this cycle so that sex isn't seen as a shameful. And actually, for those of you that are listening to this, whatever platform you're listening to this on, you're celebrating in some level your sexual energy by even being here. But there are some that would just find this too much. And yet we're all human beings born into the same world by two people having sex. And most of us want intimacy and pleasure and sex in our lives. And yet we kind of avoid it because it's surrounded with so much shame. It's surrounded by so much guilt. And it really shouldn't, that really shouldn't be the case. So what can we do to change it? Have conversations, support the young people or younger people in our lives where we can. Give space for conversations. Create an opportunity in our own life for conversations. Because often as well, the one thing I've learned is if you start a conversation with somebody, quite often they'll be like, oh, you know, I was thinking that too. But everyone's waiting for somebody else. And that can't keep going. That just gotta stop. It's gotta stop. I know that I've worked with people who have been suicidal because of the shame around sex. That's wrong. That's really wrong. No one should be in a place of that much shame, that much fear, and that much guilt around their sexuality or around their sexual choices. Healthy sexual choices. These people, like, it was healthy sexual choices, but there was so much fear and guilt from all sorts of corners of their life that they actually felt suicidal. That's wrong. No one should be in that much shame around something that is so natural and part of our human existence. It shouldn't happen. So let's start celebrating ourselves as sexual human beings. Let's start celebrating ourselves, celebrating our bodies, celebrating our creative minds, all our kinkies and our quirkies. And just find a little way in your life, just some way of just taking a step forward and celebrating your sexual self. Finding a little way to let go of that shame, whether that's just having a random conversation, well, maybe not random, but a conversation with another human being, giving them permission to be who they are, whether it's with a partner, just saying, is there anything you want to explore? Even just taking the shame out of the conversation and doing your little bit to create some magic. I hope there's something you can take away from this. If it's only just having a conversation with somebody in your life, that means that there's a little bit less shame, a little bit less fear, and a little bit less guilt around sex and sexual energy, then that would be perfect.